From the Bible, we have a definition of the created kind that is a recognizable group of similar organisms surrounded by deep discontinuity, which group persists by members interbreeding and producing similar offspring. This is something that people have been able to deduce from the Bible for quite some time. If we go back to the time of Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century, he in fact sought the biblical kind. He searched for the biblical kind, and what he did is he wanted to also name those, identify the created kinds, name them, and formalize the namings, because the issue at that point was the same organism had all sorts of different names. Different cultures, different cities, different families would have different names for the same organism, and he wanted to formalize that and give everything the same name. And he looked for the created kind. He looked for recognizable groups of similar organisms that interbreed with to produce similar offspring, and those groups were already known. He recognized those groups, and they were even called kinds. Now, we have to talk about what that means. In Linnaeus's day, the trade language of Europe, the language that people, that wasn't Linnaeus's original language, but that's a language he learned from his country of Sweden to speak with people around Europe. And the language that he used was Latin. Latin, the one derived from the Roman Empire, was the common language of the countries. It's the language you would trade with. If you're going to trade with somebody with a different language, you both knew Latin, even if you didn't know your local language. And so the language of Europe and the trade language, or if you wish, the scientific language of Linnaeus was in fact Latin. Now, in Latin language, the Bible had been translated into Latin in something like the 5th century by Jerome. So he'd taken the Bible and both the Old and the New Testament and created a Latin translation called the Vulgate. And if you look at the Vulgate translation of Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about, where it uses the Hebrew word mean and it talks about created kinds, the Latin word used to translate mean, the Hebrew word mean, was in fact the Latin word species. And so people would read the text, and 10 times it would tell them that God created after their species, according to their species, after their species. If they read it in Latin, they would understand, they would think, that God created species. And species was a term that was also applied to a group of organisms that were very similar to each other, that were different from other organisms. They interbred with each other and they produced offspring that looked like their parents. And so clearly, and I mean only naturally, Carl Linnaeus would have understood that the created kind was probably what at that point they called a species. So Carl Linnaeus started out believing that species were equivalent to, they're the same as the things called biblical kinds. He then would say that if that's true, that species shouldn't change because biblical kinds don't change, they persist through time. He would also conclude that that would mean that species shouldn't be able to interbreed with other species because created kinds are supposed to be separated from other created kinds by a deep discontinuity. They don't cross with other species or other created kinds. So Linnaeus started out his career, and he started out by studying plants, and he expanded. He worked with others to work with other organisms, but he focused most of his life on the classification and naming of plants. He assumed that plant species were in fact the biblical kinds, that plant species didn't change through time, and that plant species couldn't interbreed with other plant species. And that's only natural. It would be deduced from his reading of the Latin Bible, and it's the simplest way to understand the biological world at the time. However, what he began to realize as he collected more and more species of plants is he began to run into species that looked an awful lot like they were intermediate between two other species and were produced by those two species hybridizing. As he collected more and more data, he realized that there are more and more species of plants that really are interbreeding with other species and producing hybrids in between. And if that's the case, then it can't be that species are actually the created kinds. So partway through his career, Linnaeus began changing his mind. Rather than saying that species were the created kind, he began to think that it was the group higher than species, because what he did is group species into genera, and then genera into higher groups and so on. So he thought, well, if they're not species, maybe the created kind is the genus that the species are put into. So he began believing that the created kind was actually equivalent to the genus. And since the time of Linnaeus, Linnaeus's intuition, his belief that he was considering at that time, has been confirmed over and over again, because in fact, we have discovered that many species can actually interbreed with other species to produce hybrids. Lions can interbreed with tigers, and the different zebra species can interbreed with other zebra species to produce hybrids. And there's just lots of examples. It's all over the place. It's very common. What Linnaeus began to realize in plants, we have found to be a pretty universal observation, that many living species actually interbreed to produce hybrids. Secondly, we know in a number of examples of species that are, let's say one species is living in one area, another species is living in another area right next door. And there's a place where the two come together. In fact, there might be a place where the two species overlap, where both species are found in the same trees or in the same lake or whatever. A place where the ranges of the species overlap. And looking at that, you actually see that at the point where the two species come together, there are individuals between the two species which look to be hybrids between the two species. They might be halfway in between in size or whatever. For example, where I grew up in Illinois, we had squirrels there that when I looked up in the mammal book to figure out what species the squirrel was, I was confused because it had characteristics of the squirrel that's found in the south of the United States, and it had other characteristics of a squirrel that's found to the north of where I lived in Illinois. But these squirrels were different. They had characteristics of both, and they were much bigger than either the squirrels to the north or to the south. I came to realize that the squirrels in my area were hybrids between the two species, one northern species, one southern species, and I was living in what's called a hybrid zone between two adjacent populations of two different species. There would be usually it's a pretty narrow zone, where the two species can apparently interbreed and do interbreed, producing hybrids, and those hybrids live in that narrow zone between the two species. And we've got a number of examples of these things. There was actually a red oak species on our property that was also a hybrid between a northern red oak species and a southern red oak species. So these hybrid zones suggest also that these two species are not different created kinds, that they are in fact able to interbreed with each other. And in fact, if you look at the fossil record, we also have some examples in the fossil record of one species in this layer of rock, and then in the layer of rock above it, let's say 2 layers above that, there's another species. It's similar but different. And then in the layer in between the two, there's an organism that looks halfway in between the shape and form of the species above and the species below, as if this species changed into another species. And this is what I call a stratomorphic intermediate. It's intermediate in strata. The layers of rock are called strata. So this one in the middle is in between or intermediate between the rock layer above and the rock layer below. And it's also a morphological intermediate. its shape and form is halfway in between or partway in between the shape and form of the species below it and the species above it. It is a stratomorphic intermediate. There aren't a lot of those in the record, but we have examples of stratomorphic intermediates in the fossil record that seem to suggest that one species changes into another through time. So we've got several observations since the time of Linnaeus that confirm Linnaeus' suspicion that the created kind is higher, a larger grouping than the species. As Linnaeus continued his investigations, he began to run into, however, genera that seem to be created by hybridization. Remember, moving from a species to a bigger grouping, he moved to the genus and said, oh, now the genus is the created kind. Well, that would mean that the genus doesn't change through time, that one genus cannot interbreed with another genus. If, in fact, it's a created kind, it shouldn't be able to interbreed. But he began finding plants that he thought were hybrids between two different genera. Now, subsequent research has suggested that Linnaeus might not have been right about those speculations, but nonetheless, towards the end of his life, he began to think that maybe the created kind is even bigger than the genus. And he classified the genera together into families, what are called taxonomic families, biological families. And so he began believing that families were the level of the created kind and not genera or species. Since the time of Linnaeus, his suspicion has actually been confirmed. Even if his specific examples may not have been accurate, we have actually found a number of living genera that can interbreed with other genera and produce offspring between the two genera. For example, orchids. My word, there's thousands of species of orchids, and it's very common to take two different genera of orchids, cross them to produce a hybrid in between. In fact, the most common orchid that you might wear to a prom or something like that is in fact caused by or created by crossing 4 different genera. Take 2 different genera of orchids, cross them, take that result, cross it with a 3rd genus, and then take that result and cross it with a 4th genus. So it's actually somewhat common for us to find genera that can cross to produce hybrids. Now, we don't know of any hybrid zones between genera, like we have hybrid zones between species. But we do have in the fossil record examples of stratomorphic intermediates, one genera to another genus, to another genus, to another genus, like, for example, the fossil record of the horses. We have a series of different genera, and by the way, the singular word genus, when you make it plural, is genera. Okay, so more than one genus are genera. How do I think it goes? And so we have examples in the fossil record of one genus at one layer of rock. The next layer of rock has a similar but different genus, and the next layer of rock has a similar but different genus to that. It looks like genera have changed through time. These things suggest that what Carl Linnaeus suspected all along, that the created kind was even bigger group than the genus. Carl Linnaeus basically, by the time he died, he believed that the family, the biological family, which is a grouping of genera, was actually the created kind, and that families don't change, and that families could interbreed with other families. Since that time, this seems to be confirmed by our observation. We know of no examples of organisms from 2 different biological families being able to produce hybrids. We have no examples of hybrid zones between taxonomic families. And we have no good evidences of stratomorphic intermediates in the fossil record between families. So it suggests that in the present, we might conclude that the evidence seems to indicate that roughly at the level of family, is the created kind of the Bible. However, in some cases, it may not be the level of the family. It might be the level of the genus. In other cases, it might be a level higher than the family. It probably, roughly, we think, and we're still working this out, we got a lot of work to do to figure out, to identify the created kinds. People who are not creationists have been doing this for hundreds of years. Creationists have only been doing this for a few decades. So we're by no means anywhere close to finishing this. But it looks like most of the created kinds are about the level of the species, families. But some genera may be created kinds, and some higher taxonomic group, like superfamilies, might be created kinds. So this leads us to the present understanding of created kinds. But in studying created kinds, as creationists, we want to study the created kinds. This word kind is a little awkward. First of all, the English word has all sorts of meanings, and people might get confused between using the term biblical kind and all the other meanings that kind has. In addition, different kinds might be at different taxonomic levels. They might be at genera, they might be at families, they might be at subfamilies. So we can't just grab on and say, family equals kind, nor should we just call kinds kinds, because that would be confusing. So what happened is Frank Marsh, a creationist who lived in the early part of who actually lived through most of the 20th century, suggested in 1941 a new name, a name for the created kind, a kind of a technical name. We would use it in biology to refer to a created kind. It's baramin or baramin. Some people pronounce it baramin or baramin. The word is basically stuck together two Hebrew words, bara, which means to create, and min, which I've already referred to as a word that means kind. So put together, baramin means created kind. So a baramin is an official name or title of a group of organisms that is thought to be a biblical kind. From Frank Marsh's word, we've created a study of created kinds. A field of science has been introduced for the study of created kinds, and it's called Baraminology, created from the word baramin, meaning created kind, and logos in Greek, meaning the discussion of or the study of. This is effectively the study of baramins, the study of created kinds. So baraminology is the identification and study of baramins, created kinds. I have to tell you, I created this word and I created the field, and I know I did a no-no here. You're not supposed to create a word by putting together words from two different languages. I put together a word that's created from Hebrew with a word that's created from Greek, and some people don't like that. They don't like the merging of two different languages in that fashion. But I say, hey, God wrote the Bible in Hebrew in the first part and Greek in the second part. If I'm going to put two languages together, I should put Hebrew and Greek together. But anyway, I just let you know that it's a little odd and some people don't like it. But baraminology is the study and identification of baramins. At this point in the game, we believe that the created kind is approximately the level of families. But what that means, if that's true, and we haven't identified all the created kinds, so we're not sure how big all of them are, but some families of organisms are huge, with thousands of species. There's millions of species in the world, and if they're at the level of families, there are thousands of baramins in the world. And so there's thousands of species in some of the baramins. What's interesting about this is if what we've concluded already about baraminology is true, it actually explains a couple of things in the Bible that people have used to attack the Bible. It explains why they're not effective attacks against the Bible. For example, for a very long time, people have been concerned about the fact that Adam was somehow able to name all the bird and animal species in a single day. If he had to name all the species that exist, in the present we have thousands of species of birds, thousands of species of mammals alone. The number of species, he would have to name many thousands of species if he had to name each species. But if God took to him only created kinds, he probably only had to name about 300 created kinds, 300 baramins. So some people have been concerned there isn't enough time in a single day for Adam to have named all the birds and animals. But if in fact the created kinds were brought to him by God, as the created kinds were brought to Noah at the time of the flood, then in fact Adam would have no trouble naming all the birds and animals in a single day. Another concern is the flood account. If in fact the created kinds are species, then there would have had to have been millions of species on the ark. There just isn't enough room on the ark for that. But if in fact the created kind is at the level of the family, there's probably only a few thousand created kinds that would have had to be on the ark. The ones that swam didn't have to worry about being on the ark. It's hard to know where you'd put them if they're swimming organisms. You'd have to have a fish tank or something in the ark for it. So the ark seems to have been made for the land animals, for humans, for the land animals, the birds, and that sort of thing. And if, again, created kinds are at the level of the family, you only have to put a few thousand animals onto the ark. And the ark is able to hold tens of thousands of animals given its size. Not millions, but certainly tens of thousands. So Baraminology already suggests that some of the things that people have been concerned about and think that the Bible's wrong, in fact, can be understood as being correct. The Bible is true. The things it says are true. And Baraminology is helping us understand that.